a lot to talk about. A lot of narratives out there around who should be in the playoff. Is it Alabama? Is it Miami? Is it Ole Miss? Is it South Carolina? I know South Carolina's been the favorite of the media, of fans to get that last spot. We saw the playoff show.
The Heisman.
we saw the playoff show yesterday night, Tuesday night, and Alabama's the one that got the nod of those four teams. A lot of people not super happy about it. I know we kind of differ on our thoughts there. So let's get into it. What are your initial thoughts on the way that they seeded some of these teams?
Yeah, just based upon how they initially seeded the teams, I think I said this is the first time we did brackets and buzz. This is the most I've ever spent the time looking at the 12 seed or the 11 spot, right? And to me, it felt like from 1 to 5, they focused on a combination of strength and record and strength of schedule. Strength of record favors Texas. Strength of schedule favors some of the other Big Ten teams. We talked about Oregon having the number 60 strength of schedule. Once you get to the latter half of the rankings, we saw Indiana and SMU behind the Georgias, the Tennessees, the Ohio States. I understand Indiana being behind Ohio State since they lost to them. I'm not fully on board with them being behind Tennessee, given that they're showing the strength of record matters more for a team like Texas and Oregon compared to an Indiana. And then once we get to the back half, ultimately Miami has a better record, but Alabama has more ranked wins. Ranked wins are determined by the committee who ranks the teams. And then Miami, of course, they're sitting there around 0-1 or 0-2 in terms of ranked teams or teams that are above 500. So those are a couple of my thoughts. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts, honestly, I think that the four teams from 11 to 14 are in the proper order. I think that Alabama, I think that no team of these four deserves to be in a playoff for college football. This has been expanded to where one team has to make it. None of them deserve it, but in a 12 team, someone has to be that team. And if you put all the criteria together from the committee, I think that Alabama is the team that fits the most of that. They have the most ranked wins. They do have some bad losses on there, but so do Ole Miss, so does South Carolina, so does Miami. Not as bad, but they haven't played the level of talent that these other teams have. So there's nothing to point at to say that Miami's boosted their resume with other teams. So I'm looking at these four, the strength of schedule favors Alabama. South Carolina was always going to be behind Ole Miss and Alabama in my mind because of head-to-head. I know there was that push for them, but head-to-head has to matter no matter how early in the season it was.
I agree. Your full resume has to matter. And, we did the power rankings part of our episode on Sunday. We published it. Thank you for everyone that watched it. Yes, South Carolina looks better. Yes, they have more quality wins, but the full resume, your full schedule has to matter. If you take a class, just because you failed a test in the first half of the year, but you ultimately pass all your other tests, you still get a B, right? And that's where Alabama right now is able to get that B+ to get a higher rating in this class score, especially with the head-to-head scores there. I think that makes sense. And to me, it's like if you put South Carolina above Alabama, you're setting a really bad precedent that games on the field don't matter. If their records were the same fully, I would understand.
Yeah. If South Carolina was 9-2,
if South Carolina had one less loss, it would be a little different. I apologize there.
Yeah. If South Carolina was 10-2 and Alabama was 9-3, put them ahead. They'd have better. But now you have two teams 9-3, and I've seen the argument about Oklahoma often that South Carolina beat Oklahoma, Alabama lost to them. It works the other way for LSU, regardless of what the whistle, the yellow flag on the field says about that hit in that game. But Alabama beat LSU, who beat South Carolina. And they have the direct head-to-head. So to me, the conversation was always between Alabama and Miami. You could put Ole Miss into that conversation as well, but they have a much worse loss. We're dinging Alabama, and people are hating on Alabama for the loss to Oklahoma or a loss to Vanderbilt. Ole Miss lost to Kentucky, who is essentially, from a power ranking standpoint, I think the last ranked team in the SEC. They did get a win there. So it was always between Alabama and Miami to me. Everything aside from the win-loss record favors Alabama. Resume, opponent win percentage, strength of schedule. It's unfortunate for Miami that it played out this way because there is a world where Florida could have been better, where Louisville could have been better, Duke
Florida State could be better.
Florida State could have been better.
Yep.
It just
you can't control. It didn't play out that way, and I talked over you, so I apologize. You can't control fully who's on your schedule and how well they perform, right? We're seeing that with Indiana as well, and bringing it back to that final playoff spot conversation, because that was the majority of the dialogue that was being discussed on the college football playoff ranking show on Tuesday night. to me, it's like the ACC, given their strength of schedule, according to the SOS and how it's calculated, opponent win percentage, and their opponent's win percentage, it feels like they have less of a margin for error compared to the SEC. And so a lot of people are upset that Alabama's, like you mentioned, are able to lose to a Vanderbilt. They're able to lose to Oklahoma. And yet we watch Georgia Tech go toe to toe with Georgia, who is playing in the SEC championship, and Miami feels to be more penalized because they lost. I get it. It's a loss versus a almost loss for Georgia. They appear to be more penalized for that than the likes of other conferences and other teams. And so for me, it's tough to see a 10-2 team in that spot compared to a 9-3 team, although the majority of the data points point to it. And then from the ranked wins perspective, the committee decides who they rank. So I could see Duke, who's 9-3, being ranked. They're one of the few 3-loss teams right now from a Power 4 conference not ranked. That would help their resume. Louisville has a number 22 strength of schedule. They're not ranked either. They'd be the only 8-4 conference ranked team, but it would help Notre Dame. It would help SMU. It would help Miami as well. So just something to think about when it comes to how their record looks against the top 25.
For sure. And then, I completely agree with your point that those teams could be ranked. With that, though, even if those two teams were ranked, even if Duke and Louisville were ranked, they still wouldn't have the same amount of ranked wins as Alabama. They would have still one less loss, but the point being that the resume of the teams that they've played, they had less opportunities to prove themselves because they played less good teams that Alabama did, which means that there's less room for error. You have to prove yourself to be a stronger team with less data points because you're playing a Florida State when that should have been a good game when it's not. Alabama could say the same thing about why LSU isn't going to be one of their ranked wins because of the slide that LSU had. That was something going into the year. That was one of the key data points for Alabama. So they could say that too about teams that have slipped out since they've played them. With that, the eye test, I think that favors South Carolina. Win-loss favors Miami. But if you put the entire resume together, I think it's Alabama. I think if you put the entire thing together. Now, Ole Miss, I think, has a case to it. But the committee doesn't have a huge – they've pointed out that they're not really looking at point differential and comparative wins. So that Georgia beating – or Ole Miss beating Georgia by more points than Alabama did isn't a huge factor. So that's just something to think about. But, there's a lot of people aren't going to be happy. It could be 20 teams, 21 will be upset.
Yeah. And you're right there with you, right? There could be 20 teams, 21 would be upset. And, I think a lot of people expected to see with this expanded playoff more parity. I think we talked about it before we recorded. More parity, more non-blue bloods. And for the most part, it's all blue bloods besides SMU and Indiana. SMU getting a benefit because they're now in a Power 4 conference. I was looking at an article from ESPN, I think it came out in July. SMU is actually slated to have one of the easiest Power 4 schedules in the country. And obviously that can change as the games go on and as they their opponents play other opponents. They get the nod because they're in a Power 4 conference. Indiana's getting that nod because they're in a Power 4 conference. There's still a spot guaranteed for the G5, given they take 5 conference champs. There's only 4 Power 4 teams. But to your point, someone's going to be upset. And I think a lot of the reaction is coming from the fact that there's people that probably just don't like Alabama. Because I can sit here and I can argue for Miami. I can make a case for South Carolina, but when you look at the full body of work, they do have more ranked wins. The rankings are controlled by the committee. Talked about that earlier. But from a full resume, I could see why they picked Bama. I think people are just upset because now you're looking at the playoffs. If the season was to end today, it's 33% Big Ten, 33% SEC. So 66% of the playoffs out of 144 FBS teams are coming from 2 conferences. I don't know what the fix is there. If there needs to be one, the SOS and the ranked wins don't say there is, but it feels like the margin of error is different for certain teams. In some reasons it's justified, some it's not.
Yeah, but I mean, looking at the ACC compared to the SEC, the 2 teams playing in the ACC championship, Clemson has lost both their games to the SEC.
Yep.
SMU is now playing; they lost their game to the Big 12. So the ACC's top 2 dogs have lost games to the other conferences. So they're not necessarily proving to be one of the premier conferences. So that's why there's more of some of these teams of other conferences, because while there's a weaker schedule for Indiana, it's still a conference that is playing tough games. They're still playing Washington, Michigan, where you have, UNLV playing Colorado State, who's a weaker team on Texas' schedule, but then they needed a tune-up game. So it's an interesting, what's the fix? I think when expanded to 12, they expected to see more teams get in, and now they're upset that you're still seeing the same teams get in.
Yeah.
There was always going to be a 3-loss team. I mentioned this to you. Every year since college football playoff has started, there's been a 3-loss team inside the top 12 at the end of the year, except for 2023. And that's number 8 Utah in 2022, number 8 Wisconsin in 2016, not SEC teams. 7 Florida, 7 Auburn. So there was 3-loss teams making their way in. So this isn't an anomaly to expect a 3-loss team to get a playoff spot when it was expanded to 12.
And it's not an anomaly, but a lot of those teams you do mention were conference champions. And so when you think about the format in the past, they pretty much put 12 teams there to satisfy that New Year's Six bowl. So in order to be in the New Year's Six, you had to be in the top 12. And if you won your conference, you have to be in the top 12. So in past formats in 2 divisions, you can get into the conference championship with 3 losses and you can win it. We saw it when Utah beat USC a couple of years ago with Caleb Williams. And so I'm not saying every single team you mentioned benefited from that format, but I think that played a role in seeing Auburn where they were and in seeing where Utah was in LSU in the past when they had Burrow and they played against UCF in the Fiesta Bowl as well. Just some couple data points that I remember from what you mentioned there.
Yeah, it's just when you expand out, there's going to be teams at this point, especially in a year this year where we're seeing a lot of parity. So there was going to be a 3-loss team.
Yeah.
It's tough that it has to be an Alabama team who has some really, really bad losses on their resume. I think South Carolina is the team that I'm an Alabama fan. I think South Carolina would have been the eye test, most fun team from a fan perspective, from a who's playing the best football right now perspective. But that just, if we're using that level of subjectivity in a year where Alabama was better, if they did that same thing for Alabama and said they're the best team, they should just be in, that people wouldn't be happy with that. It's fun now when it's South Carolina to have that conversation, but there needs to be a level of subjectivity removed. And I think that by looking at strength of schedule, a computer-based thing, record versus top 25, a factual-based thing, there is some subjectivity with who is ranked. I saw that the BCS model ran this, and it was the same top 12 aside from South Carolina would have been 12 instead of Miami, but Alabama would have still been in the top 12 with the BCS model.
Which is, it's interesting. The BCS model, I've seen some people calling for that to come back. Like you mentioned, and I'm going to wrap my point at least. It's a debate for who gets the last spot. On one hand, you could say that no one deserves it. On the other hand, someone's getting in, someone's getting the playoff money, someone gets a chance to ultimately compete for that national championship. And you want that spot, right? You win your games. You don't let the committee control your destiny, because Alabama's still in a spot where they don't fully control their destiny. Miami would be in the same spot where they don't control their destiny. Rounding out the top 25, I think the committee mostly got it right. Ultimately, I feel like BYU should be higher, given they've beat SMU. I talked about that earlier. Sometimes you see things that make you shake your head, like Missouri's still ranked despite not beating any of the good teams on their schedule. They probably have a great SOS, but you're not beating any of the teams. So if you're the ACC, do you just schedule better teams and bank on a loss? I guess that's kind of where Clemson's at. They scheduled a tough Georgia. They lost. And now because the conference appears to be pretty easy, they're in the conference championship. The other side, I would say that, Syracuse should be ahead of UNLV. It doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of what's going to happen in the Mountain West Championship. To me, it just kind of makes me question a little bit of what the committee saw there and what they watched.
Yeah, I think BYU should be higher. I think Clemson should be further down. I do think that there's potential to get one of those other ACC teams in there. But from a scheduling standpoint, yeah, I think that you need to schedule some tougher games within your conference, because that's what's working so well for the SEC is that you're saying, Georgia beat Texas, but Alabama beat Georgia, but Tennessee beat Alabama. You're able to do this round robin, mental math to get to the point of saying that all of these teams have done something to earn it. If this was a schedule where Miami played SMU and Miami lost to SMU and didn't lose to Georgia Tech, I think that Miami would be in, because they'd have a better loss on their resume. They didn't even have to win a better game.
Yeah.
Because of them having better games scheduled. So I think you have to schedule good games. There was no telling that SMU was going to be this team this year. They thought that was probably going to be Florida State, the winner of the conference last year, and it was not. So yeah, I think you just have to schedule games because the top 3 teams in the ACC didn't play each other.
They didn't, right? In SMU, they won the American Athletic last year, but they lost to Boston College in the bowl game. They were playing Preston Stone at quarterback. I would imagine he's in the portal here soon, but they have Kevin Jennings now, and they're playing a lot better. They probably didn't expect them to be in that conference championship discussion, and here they are, highest ranked team in the ACC. When we look at the playoff bracket, on one hand, it feels like it's like, why are we doing this when we know it's going to change? On the other hand, it's interesting. Let's be serious. It's fun. Which of these matchups excite you the most?
Alabama, Notre Dame. It's a run it back from 2013. It would be a tough game. A lot of people have been touting that, SEC having to go play a tough game in the cold in December is a tough thing to ask for. And this would be one of those games where Alabama's going to play at Notre Dame. This is one where it could not change. Like, this could be one that also stays because we don't have Notre Dame playing in a game, Alabama not playing in a game, depending on what happens with the spots around them.
Yeah, it really just depends on what happens with the spots around them. And, if you're a Notre Dame or Alabama fan and we say SMU wins this game, if you're watching this, you can see the bracket. SMU would play the winner of Alabama and Notre Dame based upon how the committee has ranked these teams to date. Do you like that matchup if you're Notre Dame or you're Alabama?
I think that this is I think that right now, really, Penn State probably has the best run, but I think that Alabama has the next best one to play Notre Dame and SMU. I wouldn't want to be Georgia having to play Indiana and then playing Texas for a third time, or Ohio State having to play Tennessee and then Oregon, or Tennessee having to play Ohio State and Oregon. So I do think this is a decent draw for Alabama. I think it's a decent draw for Notre Dame. They're both beatable teams. So they're looking at each other knowing that there's a potential there to do so.
Definitely. I like the game that excites me the most is definitely the Ohio State-Tennessee matchup. Two blue bloods, Nico versus Will Howard. What can this Ohio State defense do against Dylan Sampson? Does Tennessee have an answer for the dual running back threat of Quinshon Judkins and Trayvon Henderson? I like that matchup a lot. I think the debate this week prior to the rankings was, should Ohio State be ranked higher or Tennessee? I think the committee got it right. Ohio State has more quality ranked wins than Tennessee does, but this Tennessee team, they're interesting. I don't know which Nico I'm going to get sometimes, but I do know what I'm going to get from Dylan Sampson. I do know what I'm going to get from that defense, and so it'd be a fun matchup to see what they can do against Will Howard and that team.
Yeah, for sure. And I think in this one, either team, I can see either team winning this game. I like Tennessee in this game. They've faltered, against Georgia recently, but Ohio State losing to Michigan, so either team could show something different in their worst side, or they could show their best side. But the ranking of it does matter a ton, because playing that game in Columbus versus playing that game in Neyland is huge. Like, so that difference of which one is ahead of the other, I think, is one of the biggest seeding, when you're looking at the top 12 teams, one of the biggest seeding conversations that they had to have.
Definitely. And it involves two teams that are not playing here, on this upcoming conference championship weekend. Like I said, I said it on the last episode, I feel like Ohio State made out like a bandit. Losing to Michigan might have been one of the best things they could have done. Obviously, you negate the opportunity for a first round bye, but you don't have to play Oregon for a second time. You don't have another data point for people to point to and say, hey, you're legit or you're not legit. And Penn State's in the opposite spot. So, and Penn State gets to play Arizona State. I kind of like Arizona State in that matchup a little bit. I feel like they could maybe pull off some magic there in State College.
Yeah, I think so too. I absolutely think so. Arizona State's been playing some good football lately.
What do we do with Notre Dame in terms of, should we expect them to schedule an extra game? Like, they don't have an opportunity for another loss.
But why schedule a tougher game? Because I think the committee has shown, to their fault, that if you just go undefeated, as long as you're not an Army or something, or just playing some really, really, really weak strength of schedule, if you can get one loss, you're going to be in. So if you're, Alabama, if you're Penn State, if you're one of these teams, if you had the easiest schedule possible, as long as you only lose one game, then you're good. Now you lose two, you run the risk of being a Miami that gets kicked out because you did an easy schedule, or you had
BYU as well.
BYU.
Right? Once they got their second loss, you can't afford the second loss if your SOS is not favorable in statistically. And then the ranked wins is ultimately subjective based upon how they think your conference looks, who they rank, right? Last week, the Big 12 had 4 ranked teams in the bottom 20. So if you beat them, they fall out. If you lose, you fall out. It was a lose-lose situation. But they're showing that if you have that weaker SOS, according to the stats, you have to go one loss or perfect to stay in those spots. So For all the people that are listening to this that don't love the SEC, thank you for tuning in. And for the people that do love it, you're seeing that you have a larger margin of error according to the committee this year compared to other conferences. And in some ways, I think that's fair. In other ways, I think it's a case-by-case basis. So.
Yeah, all schedules aren't created equal, so there has to be some sort of context provided to those things. So
yeah, absolutely. Any closing thoughts here, final thoughts when it comes to the rankings, conference championship weekend, the hypothetical bracket, the playoff odds per team?
I guess I want to ask you real quick, if SMU loses this game, do you think that they're in? Just personally, do you put SMU in if they lose to Clemson?
I feel like the SOS, which they're sitting, I think, below 50.
77.
77. I think you said earlier 77, right? The SOS
75.
doesn't favor 75, right? The SOS doesn't favor them. Although it's still better or close to what Boise State's is, but with another loss, I think the committee, the right decision in my mind would be to put SMU in. I don't see how it's fair that they played an extra game and they're penalized, and there's multiple teams that can sit at home and get in that have 2 losses. I get that those teams like Ohio State have better wins. Tennessee, it's like they have 1 better win. I think SMU should get in. What do I think the committee will do? I think the committee will do the right thing. I think they'll put them in.
Okay. Yeah, it would be a conversation, I guess, then between Alabama with 3-1 to top 25, SMU 0-2 to top 25. So they wouldn't have a ranked win at that point should they lose to Clemson. I completely agree with you where you can't penalize a team for playing on Saturday. I told someone, I was like, SMU should just say the bus broke. Like, we're not going to this game. Like, the bus broke down. We couldn't make it because you're in if you don't play.
You're in if you don't play.
Playing hurts you potentially.
It hurts you, right? And I don't have that same argument for Clemson because they have the 3rd loss. They have the 2 losses against the SEC. Like, because the ACC kind of had this cannibalization type year, Clemson gets in. Miami has historically choked in these positions. So all shade or no shade, however we want to take it for Miami, they have choked in these positions. I feel like I feel the same way as you do. I like morally, I just don't see how a one team can play football and lose, be the first place team, and then make another spot for a team that's sitting at home. In the way that the championships are set up this year, with most teams being the top, most divisions, most conferences not having divisions. Oh my God.
Yeah, I had to get that question out because I'm very curious as to what would happen. I don't want it to happen because I want to see Alabama in as an Alabama fan. But yeah, so I think that kind of wraps it. I don't think I have any other thoughts. I mean,
I got a question for you then, because we could do this all day. Which 2 at-large teams, if it's as it stands today, which is what it looks like it's going to be for the actual playoff revealing, which 2 at-large teams do you think have the best opportunity to win a national championship?
From the teams that would be at the back, like I'm not counting, are you saying from all 12? Or are you saying just the ones that could get in that last spot? Alabama, Miami, SMU.
I'm saying all 12. All 12.
Oh, all 12. I think probably Oregon. It's just they haven't lost yet. It's hard.
In the event they lose, in the event they lose the national, or they lose the conference championship, they would be the best at-large team.
Yeah, they would be the best at-large team. I think from all the non-conference champions, should they lose that game, I think it would be the loser of the SEC probably has the best chance after that. Like I do like Texas, even if they lose to Georgia again, I still think that Texas any given day. I think that Georgia any given day. They lost those games on the road. So Georgia losing to Alabama on the road, they put up a good fight to come back in that one. I do think that Georgia could potentially do it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I like the Georgia pick or the Texas pick depending on who loses that game. I mean, if I'm looking outside of that, I feel like Ohio State could bounce back to find themselves in a spot. It would be historical for Ryan Day. But I think the sting of those 2 losses this season, if they somehow match up again against Oregon, it's tough to beat a team twice. You get past Oregon, you're going to play either Boise State or you're going to play Penn State, according to how the bracket is now. I think that puts them in a better spot to get to the national championship. But it's all hypotheticals, right? This could change once we get the final bracket and how these teams look in the conference championship week. I mean, never want to see this happen, but injuries happen as well. So a lot could change before we get to our final bracket and our first playoff games starting December 20th. So in 16 days.
Yeah. mean, it's all hypotheticals now. The committee's at least shown us what they care about. So after Saturday, we can look and we'll record and say what we think is going to happen come Tuesday. But there's really no telling. And until then, it's all up in the air whether it will be in Alabama, whether it'll be SMU, whether Clemson can get in. We'll see on Saturday. So this was a fun one to talk about. Just so much conversation going on online about everyone's opinions and feelings about it. It's no one was ever going to be happy with the 12 team. If it could have been a 30 team playoff, 31 will be upset. So it's just one of those things.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things. I mean, I've seen South Carolina fans do gymnastics to figure out like how they have the best case to get in. Miami was trying to make the best case. Alabama was kind of sitting there calmly, knowing that things could probably wind up their way, but still watching this weekend very closely for that 8 p.m. game, Eastern, 7 p.m. Central, if you're in Alabama. But such a fun season. The conversation on Twitter has been great, or X. The conversation in the forums has been great. I saw some funny stuff on one of the Ohio State forums talking about what they could do in terms of Ryan Day's contract. It's just, this is what we love about college football, just the madness, the craziness. And we finally are at the point where the bracket is just about 90% done. So we'll see what happens on Saturday. For everyone that watched here, thank you for tuning in. If you haven't subscribed yet, like I mentioned, please do. We're coming with you with previews, game recaps, our brackets and bros-esque talking about the playoff brackets on the format. And until next time, I'm Randall Duck Jr. We got Hunter's Eastman here, and that's it.